Dr. Lisa Lee is Executive Director of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She earned her PhD at Johns Hopkins, an MA in Educational Psychology from the University of Colorado, and an MS in Bioethics from Alden March Bioethics Institute at Albany Medical College. Dr. Lee is an epidemiologist and public health ethicist. The focus of her current work is bioethics pedagogy and public health ethics. Her prior work at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention included the ethics of public health surveillance, privacy and public health data use, and infectious disease epidemiology. During her 14-year career at the Center for Disease Control, she held several leadership positions, including the agency's Assistant Science Officer and Director of the Office of Scientific Integrity. Dr. Lee is the lead editor of Principles and Practice of Public Health Surveillance, 3rd edition, Oxford University Press. She's authored numerous publications in both science and ethics, and serves as associate editor for the Journal of Bioethical Inquiry and Public Health Reviews. Dr. Lee serves on the executive board of the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics and is an adjunct professor at the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Education Research at Albany Medical College, where she teaches ethics. She is the recipient of the 2014 Pellegrino Medal for Excellence in Bioethics. It's my great pleasure to have her here with us. I hope you'll join me in welcoming her to Clemson.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you all so much for being here. I understand I'm competing with the most beautiful day of the year, so I appreciate your being in here with me to talk a little bit about the ethics of excellence in research. I'm really honored to be here. I'm delighted with the invitation and appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of the work we've been doing at the Presidential Bioethics Commission. As I am a federal employee, I must disclaim my comments and say that these are my views and my views alone, not those of the commission, nor those of any federal government agency. So, when I was a baby epidemiologist, I just freshly graduated, finished my dissertation, opened the New Yorker magazine and saw this comic that says, "And it was so typically brilliant of you to have invited an epidemiologist." And I thought to myself, wow, that is me. I am going to be invited to swanky parties on Park Avenue, wearing a little black dress and pearls, talking with people who are really important. Didn't really turn out that way for me, but I am really happy that it did get me gigs like this, which is to talk today about the two things that I care most about, which are science and ethics, epidemiology and ethics. I'm really pleased to have had the opportunity to do really important work in ethics in my public health career, and now have transitioned to doing ethics full time. What I want to talk about today in the next 45 minutes or so, as long as I can keep your attention, is a little bit about the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. I will refer to it from now on as the Bioethics Commission. It's a mouthful. Then we'll talk a little bit about excellence in science, ethical excellence in science, and then ways that this commission has thought a little bit, or a great deal actually, about getting there. We'll talk about various kinds of ethics, integrating ethics across disciplines and levels, creating resources and training teachers at all levels. Before I start though, I just want for all of us to think about the first word or two that comes into your mind when you hear the word ethics. Now you probably thought of 10 or 20 by now, but my guess is the first couple that you've thought of, or at least from what I hear from most people who I ask this question to, is IRB. It's not really a word, but people do think of that first. And compliance, what I shouldn't do, what I can't do, what I'm not supposed to do. Some people even think about stop signs, things that will stop my work. And it's my intention as we talk about the work of the Bioethics Commission to convince you that, in fact, if we set out to integrate and infuse ethics throughout the scientific process, from the very inkling of an idea all the way through implementing it to make society better. If we infuse ethics into that, we won't need to have stop sign ethics will actually facilitate science. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, how we hope to do that. Before I go there, I want to just give you a brief overview of the Bioethics Commission. How many of you have heard of the Presidential Bioethics Commission? Okay, a handful, way higher proportion than most audiences I talk with. The Presidential Bioethics Commission was authorized by President Barack Obama in 2009. He asked for a commission to be seated that would help him think about the ethical way forward as we face innovation in medicine, science, technology. And it was really clear to him that what he needed was a diverse set of perspectives to do that work. And in fact, he asked that a panel be drawn from various fields, not just bioethics, but also science, engineering, law, and other social sciences. And in fact, that's what the commission turned out to be. We are chaired by Dr. Amy Gutman, who is also the president of the University of Pennsylvania. She's a political philosopher in her day job. Dr. James Wagner, who is an engineer in his day job and also the president of Emory University in Atlanta, he's our vice chair. And then we have, as you can see from the persons listed here, we have folks who are physicians, researchers, geneticists, lawyers, philosophers, we have nurse, a variety of perspectives that actually mirror what the president had asked for. This commission, since 2009, has been in existence since then, but it isn't the first bioethics commission or presidential or national commission we've had. Our first bioethics commission was authorized by Congress through public law for 4 years. That's the National Commission. And what precipitated that? Tuskegee, the syphilis studies in Tuskegee, the untreated cohort of men, about 399 men, who were denied access to penicillin once it was discovered, and for the sake of a natural history observational study. After a public health advisor in California broke the story that in the 70s there were men who were being denied access to penicillin to treat their syphilis, rightfully so, Congress said, wow, we need to take a look at this. They created a board to actually do an investigation into that study. And as a result of that, one of the recommendations of that board was to create a national commission that would help us create ideas, guidance, regulations about how to do human subjects research. What should we do when we ask people to participate in research? And the key difference here being that when we're in a clinical situation, we say, I'm willing to take on risks for myself because I will benefit. But when we enroll in a research project, we say, I'm willing to take on risk for myself, not for my benefit, but for the benefit of others, either other people in the future, et cetera. So given that change in the risks and benefits, or that difference in the risk and benefits, there needed to be some kind of clear guidance about what we do when we ask people to take on that risk. So they're most well known for the Belmont Report, which lays out the principles that a researcher should consider when inviting subjects to take part. There have been several others, throughout 6 of us total, and each has come and gone with the sunset of the public law in the case of the first 2, or with the end of the administration of the presidential commissions. We too will finish our work by January 20th, 2017. So we will cease to exist once the president leaves office. But we have served him well over the last several years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how that service has lent itself to this idea of ethical excellence in science. Benjamin Franklin, over 250 years ago, was lamenting the fact that he was too old, he was going to not be able to be around to see man's power over matter. All the scientific progress that was being made, where in fact our agricultural output would be doubled with half the effort, and perhaps all diseases and would either be prevented or cured. He was sad that he wasn't going to be around to see all that. He also was sad about the fact that we hadn't made the moral progress that mirrors the scientific progress he was anticipating. He said he wished we would learn to cease treating each other like wolves. And I think about that question, about treating each other in a way that was not great. And he made those comments long before we ever saw unethical research or that those were unmasked. But there are a lot of incidences in science and research where we haven't been that good to each other. So as he's lamenting that, I want to say that we currently, since the 70s, have been paying very particular attention to excellence in research, ethical excellence in research, and Tuskegee certainly was the impetus of that, but unethical science goes way back, probably as far back as science goes. There's an article in here from the Illinois Medical Journal from September of 1913. And then, of course, there's Henry Beecher's famous article of 1966 from the New England Journal of Medicine that outlined 22 studies that were he perceived as unethical and the reasons why. And then, of course, in the 70s when Tuskegee was uncovered. And since then, we've seen an increase in the number of retractions. We've seen falsification of data, most recently in some surveys around attitudes that were recently in California. So this isn't a new problem, and we're not going to solve this today. But I do want to point out that what we're interested in doing with this body of work that the Commission has created over the last 7 years is to really think hard about what are the drivers of unethical science. What are the proximal drivers and what are the distal drivers? All of this because what we would like is for science to do its best to produce human flourishing. We want to use science in a way, the reason we do science is to make life better. And we want to be thinking about ways that we can create accurate science that will actually help human flourishing. And it's exactly that the Bioethics Commission has been thinking about for the last several years. We've done several different reports that look at this idea of how we can both conduct science ethically and use science ethically. So in the very first report that they did, a project that they did, they looked at new technologies, in this case synthetic biology. What are the ethical drivers there? What should we be paying attention to? We also looked at things like, should we test anthrax vaccine with children in case there is an anthrax attack, because we don't have data now on what to do with kids if we have an attack. Should we do that test? Should we put kids at risk for an event that has unknown and probably unknowable probability of occurring? Should we do science that we hope never to use, is the question there. And that's an unusual one for most scientists. We do science because we want to use it, not because we don't want to. We did some work on privacy and whole genome sequencing. We all know that there are a lot of data out there, and one of those collections of data might be our A's, T's, C's, and G's of our whole genome, and it won't be long before those are identifying. And what do we do about that? And how do we address the privacy of research participants who want to help but are worried about their confidentiality? And we just finished up a 2-volume report on creating a set of parameters, a code kind of ethical approach to doing contemporary neuroscience. I mean, we all are familiar with the former neuroscience where we had a couple of people who seemed to respond well to a lobotomy, and we instituted that widely, and it didn't turn out to be such a great thing. In contemporary neuroscience, we have a whole different field in front of us. And the question really is how do we do that science ethically? And how do we ensure that the implications of the research implementing the research is done in a way that doesn't increase disparities or doesn't, that it's distributed in a way that's just and fair. So these are the kinds of questions that have been rolling around in the heads of our commission members to date. So the question is, how do we get there? How do we get ethical excellence in science? So we probably need to talk a little bit about ethics. And often we think of science and we think of the ethics of science as research subjects, IRBs, IACUCs if we happen to be doing research with animals. And that's part of it. But there's a wide spectrum of ethics that we need to consider when we think about creating ethical excellence across the lifespan of science. So it does take bioethics, and yes, it does take medical ethics, and yes, it takes legal ethics, and yes, it takes ethics. And we're going to think a little bit together today about what all that means and how we can put something together to help infuse ethical excellence into science. So yes, it takes ethical scientists to do ethical science. This tends to be related to a field or a subfield we call professional ethics. This is where usually a code of ethics or something where we would say, what does it take to be a good fill in the blank? And by good, I don't mean competent, I mean good. A person, a professional who does things ethically. We also have to think carefully about incentives for ethical conduct of research, as well as ethical communication of research. And this obviously requires us to reflect on the research ethics piece, and this is the one that most people are quite familiar with through what they claim to be excruciating experiences through them mostly. And it also takes communication ethics. It takes thought about what we see as what the Commission has called the hype pipeline. And by the hype pipeline, I mean the incredible pressure to come up with the next best thing. And the next best thing might be, according to the hype pipeline, the very thing you just observed in your study of n=4, or your study of a handful of very select participants. And how that hype pipeline happens is that as a scientist, we really want to be funded. There are limited funds for science. We really want to make a mark. We want to discover things. We want to move science forward. And all that takes recognition of our work. Recognition of our work is really important to our universities as well. We all know that there's a comm shop, a PR shop that gets the good work of the university out there, or the institute out there. And then those are the first two steps, but then we say, wow, we have this reporter on the line. And the reporter is really excited that you have now, from your study of 4 participants, that your university thinks is going to be really important someday for finding the cure for something. Now the newspaper reporter wants the headline of what you've just discovered, what cure you've just discovered. So you can see already it's kind of like that game you play in grade school where you whisper in one person's ear this telephone, and by the time it gets to print into the popular press, we've now discovered something that is completely unrelated to the actual study. Or if it is related, it's clearly an exaggeration. So our ethical responsibility about communicating science well and ethically is critically important. We also need to think about, in this ethics, kind of the whole range of ethics, the kinds of ethics, we need to think about consequences, swift and severe consequences for misconduct, for scientific misconduct. There are some really interesting data that show that in countries and in research settings that have clear compliance programs, we seem to have less misconduct. So some of us are driven by our virtue inside to do the right thing. Other times, or other people, maybe other times in our lives, we might respond more to the external regulatory or compliance issues. The point being that it takes a lot to make an ethical scientist. It takes psychological features and factors, it takes sociological factors, it takes compliance. All of this matters. And in much of the work we've done in ethics, especially in the last few years around compliance, is that we focus on research ethics, or we focus on the code of ethics for our profession. And that isn't alone, those things will not work. We have to think about that whole scientific process, including, and very importantly, the implementation of our findings. In our reports on the neuroscience and ethics reports we did that the president asked us to do, one of the things that was really important was that he asked for specifically is how do we think about ethically implementing the findings of this contemporary neuroscience? What do we need to think about in terms of justice? How do we ensure that we actually have the right people represented in the research so they can benefit from the results? So take that one more step and we start asking questions about, well, this is about neuroscience, which is about our brain, and if we are asking, if researchers are doing work to help us think about diseases or conditions that affect our brain, that is the very organ they're studying is the organ that helps us decide whether we can consent to do things. And so if we're studying, for example, some dementia, how do we balance the risk of a person without consent needing to participate in the research in order for the benefits to be had? So these are all the kinds of questions that the commission really thought about. They are somewhat related to research ethics, but also to these really important pieces of implementation and ensuring that the right people get the results and that they get implemented in the right populations, all populations who need them. Getting to the place where we have ethical excellence in science and in research requires a lot of things. It requires a commitment from all of us to address this whole process of science and to keep the ethical considerations of that whole process in mind as we go through. There are a lot of things we can do. I'm going to focus on 3 of them today, and you probably have other ideas as well. These 3 come, as I mentioned earlier, from the body of work of this Presidential Bioethics Commission. And the first will be, I'll talk a little bit about integrating ethics from the very start throughout the scientific process, which I've just described to you. And this does require all of us, a collective prioritization of ethical science. This is something that really does matter across the board, with this goal of improving human flourishing, which is we talked about earlier. There's really no other reason to do science and to do research except to make the world a better place. So the first one about integrating ethics. The second thing we'll talk about is resources for researchers. There are a lot of researchers that we've talked to over the years who are concerned about ethics halting, slowing, impeding their work. And those kinds of beliefs can often lead a researcher to not address an ethical issue they perceive to be present. So we do need to be thinking about resources for researchers to help them through those pots. And finally, training educators. If we're going to talk about ethical scientists and getting people throughout that whole process to think ethically, to talk about ethical issues, to identify the ethical concerns that they might have, we have to make sure that the people who educate these future scientists are okay with bringing up topics that might not have a clear answer, that might be uncomfortable for people to be involved. So I'll talk about the work that they're doing now, the Bioethics Commission is doing now to talk about training educators. So let's start with integrating ethics. So the Bioethics Commission has talked about ethics education since its very first report on synthetic biology, where it actually recommended that that the focus not just be on human subjects participation, but actually that all scientists, bench scientists all the way through implementers and science policy folks, be trained in ethics and understand that whole system of research and where ethics falls in. And it can't just be a recitation of what the requirements are, what the IRB requirements are, or what the, what the ethical words are. It actually has to be transformational learning. It has to be more than just the ability to recite what's important about ethical research. It has to be a formation of habit, of virtue, of a real ability to reflect, to have reflective equilibrium, to think about a situation, to think about implications of the work, and to talk and discuss that. It also, in terms of this full integration at all levels of education, there has been since the start of bioethics, and I mostly come from that perspective, there has been a desire over many, many years, many decades, to think about ways that we can do dual training. So we could have a scientist who has competence in ethics, this dual competence. And that we might have ethicists who work in biomedicine and technology who also have enough competence in science to understand what's going on. And this is in part to bridge that communication gap, where a scientist will often say, you have no idea how science works, to the ethicist. You have no idea how what we're doing, or so to just fly in here and say yes, no, yes, you're right, you're wrong is just inappropriate. And frankly, a good ethicist would think that was inappropriate as well. So, but what we really want is to ensure that we've got this dual competence so people can actually talk to each other and understand both perspectives. The other really cool thing about ethics, I think there are a lot of cool things about ethics, but one of the things I think is really cool is this idea that there are some data that support that ethics can ignite interest in science. And this is especially important to me as we think about engaging girls in STEM. We think about ways we can get girls to not be afraid of math or to be interested in science. One of the ways we can do that is to talk about the ethics of science, because it can, for many young people, girls and boys alike, but certainly for young girls, it can help spur an interest in something that they just thought was either beyond them or just not that interesting. So it's an important thing that led this commission also to think about, how do we move even earlier? By the time a person gets to graduate school, and we try to help them understand about the ethical, the ethics of science and integrating that, not that it's too late, but it's a much different battle than if we would start early and we would start helping people see the ethical issues, be able to articulate those and reason through them and then implement them. So really, I think the idea of integrating and infusing ethics across, whether it's across the curriculum, however it is you want to say this, but certainly across the scientific process and at all levels of education is really important. They have said many times this commission has said many times that integrating ethics explicitly and early is critical. This is from conceptualizing the project all the way through implementation. And this is true for bench scientists who say, I don't really think about ethics, need ethics, because all I'm really doing is messing with cells. Or I never interact with people or animals, I'm just looking at blood spots. And again, this is kind of to widen our perspective about what ethical science is. Yes, ethical science is treating research participants with respect, but it's so much more. It's about thinking about what might this project lead to? What would the implications be? I was on the phone the other day with a student who was telling me about some work she was doing. She was very interested in ethics. I had done a talk at her university, and she wanted to talk about how to do ethics and how to get involved in ethics and what the jobs were in ethics and how she could do this. And she said, I did for my senior thesis some work on a new breed of mushrooms, because as you might know, they're very much alike. Like each other, and then if one bad thing happens to a mushroom, then the whole supply is knocked out. So I was thinking about that work and how that I really wasn't doing anything, the ethics didn't play a role, and I don't want to do that my whole life. And so I said, well, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's unpack that ethics doesn't really play a role. What does that mean if you introduce a new something into the ecosystem. Well, yeah, that, I guess that might have implications down the road. What kind of implications might that have? What if it didn't work as you planned and it's out there and it's like kudzu or some other horrible invasive plant? Yeah. So let's kind of unpack what those ethical issues are. And as we talked through that, I mean, I was on the phone, but I could really see the light bulbs going off for her, thinking about, wow, this is bigger than just, do I do research with human participants? So that's the kind of thing that I think is really important for us to help all scientists to think about. Not just their particular work, but what matters about their work. And since we know that science is to help improve human flourishing, there's got to be some connection between the work they're doing and the implementation of that. So I think that that's a place where we can really help scientists understand the role of their work in the ethical atmosphere. Finally, creating expectations of ethical and scientific excellence. One of the things that our commission has said many, many times is good science is ethical science. You can't take those apart. And so really helping all of our colleagues, our students, our mentors and our mentees recognize the expectation that science, in addition to being excellent in terms of accurate and applicable, one of the ways in which it's excellent and must be excellent is ethically. And creating those expectations, I think, are really, really important. As I mentioned, the commission has made numerous recommendations about integrating ethics. So in our first report, we talked about helping all scientists learn about the ethical value of their work and incorporating those kinds of perspectives into their work. In our report on neuroscience, our 2 reports on neuroscience, we thought carefully about integrating ethics across that whole spectrum of science, to develop models, to think about where ethics fits in each of the steps of science. In our whole genome sequencing, one of our reports on whole genome sequencing, the commission actually recommended that we teach consumers about the ethics of the science that they're consuming. So ethics is not a special thing that happens in an auditorium. It is important in science across the board, including all persons affected by science. We also, as I had mentioned, we're thinking far beyond RCR, responsible conduct, and IRB and compliance. We're really thinking about foundational ethics education to promote literacy, ethical and scientific literacy, in our professional lives, to be sure, but also in our personal lives. We're all going to face bioethical issues someday in our life. Most of us will. So in May this year, the commission will put out what will be their final report that is looking at how we incorporate deliberation around tough ethical issues with ethical education to make use of that virtuous circle that those 2 things form. That bioethics is an important set, skills in bioethics are important for all scientists and technology students and professionals. And that we're really looking at this ethics not as how do I tell what's right or wrong. That's a common misconception about what ethics is. It's not, I mean, a bioethicist, for example, doesn't have a red phone on their desk and it rings and they say, oh yeah, that's the right one. Call the bioethicist. It's not a moral authority. It is really thinking about how we help scientists, and all people, but in this case scientists, identify what these ethical dimensions are. And remember that every ethical dimension is not an ethical dilemma. There are lots of ethical dimensions to a lot of things that don't present a difficult decision. And we go through our day and we do pretty fine making those decisions. Most of us have a moral compass and it's mostly pointed north and we mostly do the right thing. Ethics, when we talk about teaching professionals about ethics and especially ethics across science, is about recognizing those pieces of it, articulating what they are, especially recognizing when two things might be in conflict, and it's not entirely clear what to do. So when we talk about ethical dilemmas, we're talking about the ones that rise way to the top, where the answers aren't clear, and where we might need some help. And by help, it might mean something as simple as some time and space to reflect on what to do. Help might be to engage other colleagues about these competing things and what to do. And as we think about ways or skills or tools or all those things to deliberate about what the possibilities are, we're often choosing between 2 or 3 perfectly reasonable solutions that have different risk-benefit profiles, for example. Or sometimes we're unfortunately forced with this decision of bad or worse, or bad or really bad, or something like that. But most times, we're thinking about a skill set that helps people outline what the benefits and risks are of each of their choices. And then finally, we want them to be able to implement their decision and to reflect on how that's going, to evaluate whether they want to go back and take a different decision, or whether they feel they made the right one and can now reflect on it so they know what to do in the next time. So those 4 areas of competence are what we're really after. We're not trying to help people create a list of the right things and a list of the wrong things. Rather, we're hoping to create thinking, reflective scientists who can identify what the issues are, articulate them, decide on a way forward, and then implement and evaluate that way forward. That's what integrating ethics is about. I want to talk just for a minute here about training educators. So all this stuff I've been talking about is we're going to teach people this, we're going to train people and give people skills to do this. Well, we need people who can do that. And if, like the Bioethics Commission has stated it wants to do, is to move that as far back and in the educational process as possible, we're going to have to train educators at all levels, preschool teachers, all the way through tenured professors, about how to deal with these ethical issues, how to be prepared to raise them and address them in a classroom. This gets easier in college because kids are over 18 and they don't need their parents' permission to, teachers don't need parents' permission to bring up tough topics. But it's really important in those younger years to be able to bring up and address these difficult topics. And so we've heard a lot from teachers that one of the main reasons they don't teach ethics is not because it doesn't come up, but as soon as it does, they want it out of there because they're afraid of not being able to handle it. Often they're afraid that they're not going to have the right answer, hence the misconception that what ethics is having the right answer. But if there's not a right answer, then it's even more scary to think about how are we just going to let this conversation go, and what if it gets out of hand and I don't know what to do, and I don't want parents and or administrators breathing down my neck about having brought that up. So we did a search for what kinds of resources are available for teachers, especially teachers in middle and high school, and we found some really good ones. The National Institutes for Health, for example, has a couple of really great curricula, and in both of those, one for 6th and 7th grade and one for high school, in both of those there's a fantastic section on how to do this if you're a teacher. Not how to do this if you're an ethics teacher, but how to do this if you're a social studies teacher or a science teacher. And there's some really superb resources out there that we hope, as we roll out this next report, to actually make some contact with departments of education and help them understand that these kinds of resources are available for their teachers and their graduates. So I want to also mention that there are other some resources that this commission has actually created itself. So we've done 8 or I guess 9 topics, and we have created about 60 educational materials based on those 9 topics. Now, based on the scientific topic like synthetic biology or new technologies, but also based on some of the key ethical themes across the work, like informed consent, We might be talking about informed consent with respect to our report on medical countermeasure research with children. Or we have resources about informed consent working with people with impaired consent capacity in our neuroscience and ethics report. So on our website at bioethics.gov, there are many, many resources for teachers, for scientists, for researchers to actually take a look at very concrete, contemporary, national level bioethical issues and incorporate those into their courses. We were very fortunate to have an instructor from a community college do a sabbatical with us last year. And he's a science teacher, teaches biology and such, introductory level at his community college. And he's always been very interested in ethics. And one of the things he said was, I want to make sure I'm doing it right. I want to make sure I know what I'm teaching. And I want also to share with my colleagues that they too can incorporate these kinds of discussions and increase interest in science by incorporating these kinds of discussions. And he came and did a great job working with us on creating some guides for classroom discussion. Those are also available at our website. He spent the last year, after he returned to his community college, actually implementing these, and we're looking forward to some feedback from him shortly about those materials. So the level, the range, there's a whole host of resources there that the Commission has developed. I also want, so we talked a little bit about integrating across the scientific process. We talked some more about helping educators and helping educators teach about and deal with these ethical issues. I do want to talk some about what we do with people who are already through their education, these kind of prevalent scientists. How do we help them? People who perhaps haven't had ethics training and whose only experience with ethics is the IRB or somebody telling them they can't do something. One of the things that the Commission was very interested in is what are people doing now for their scientists? What at organizations, at universities, et cetera. And we uncovered some really innovative and creative ways that people are helping their scientists deal with ethical considerations across the span of their work. One of them is a federal agency that is called DARPA. Anybody familiar with DARPA? The Defense, I forget what it stands for, but they do lots of really interesting work. Much of their work is, and how we interacted with them, much of their work on neuroscience. And when we were just talking with them about doing the neuroscience report, they got a lot of the money from the BRAIN Initiative, which is a presidential White House initiative to beef up brain research. They decided that ethics was so important. This is a defense research agency. And they decided that ethics was such an important thing to infuse in their scientists who got this brain funding, that they were going to actually implement an institutional infrastructure for every project officer to have access to an ethicist, one or more ethicists. And so they created a board of 6 independent ethicists who serve as a resource for every project related to their neuroscience funding. And this board reviews protocols, talks with the researcher about what the potential issues are across the span of the project. They serve as a mentor. They can be a resource through day-to-day practice of their research. And every project is assigned an ethics mentor. So this is from an agency that does a lot of classified research. But for the stuff that they're doing with the BRAIN Initiative, they decided it was so important to ensure that the ethics involved with the process was infused that they were going to assign every project an ethics mentor. This reflects a little bit what we used to think of some time ago, maybe a decade ago, where we used to, a PI could put in for a grant and they would have a plan for a trial, for example, and have a design, it's fine. And there was no expectation that they would really have any other statistical expertise, for example. But it was clear that what ended up happening was a lot of times statisticians would be asked to come in at the end after all the data were collected and fix a mess that had to do with something that happened way earlier in the study. And so then it became much more the expectation that an epidemiologist, a clinical trialist, anyone who, a social scientist doing research needed to have this kind of expertise on the team. And I envision a future, so now it's routine. I mean, you see a group of researchers, it's multidisciplinary, and one of those disciplines is a statistician who can do whatever they need to do with the data. I envision a future where we actually have that same kind of expectation for the ethical perspectives. And again, across the research and across the science, the span of the work, not just for, although certainly possible to have, but not just for the human subjects piece. And I think that the approach that DARPA has taken is one step toward that, and I really applaud them for that really bold step forward. Another way that we thought, we discovered that people were doing this was really embedding this ethical perspective in the research team. We have had situations and heard of situations where research ethics and societal implications, a person with that perspective is on the team, like the bioethicist, or like the statistician is now, to facilitate the science, to be able to say, we're going to move from this, oops, I did something wrong and you're shutting down my study ethics, to how do we really think about these things from the start so we can facilitate the science. And that really has been something that's worked well. Another approach that I think is really picking up steam here across our country and in several research institutions is this idea of a bench-side research consultation service, research ethics consultation service, where people who do research, just like they can in a clinical setting, you can call a clinical consult, an ethics consult for a tough clinical problem, that they've developed these groups of people with expertise in ethics and science to serve as resources for their peers who want to talk about an ethical situation or an ethical dimension they hadn't thought of that surprised them, or worse, a real ethical dilemma that they're unsure what to do with. There has been funding for these kinds of research ethics consultations and some evaluation of these. So it is something I think that we will see a lot more of. And people who've used this service, researchers who have used this service are very happy to have a place that isn't compliance, but is robust ethics. So again, one of those areas where a researcher might need that kind of guidance as opposed to a compliance type guidance, but both are important. And finally, one of the things that we think is really important, especially on the two ends of the science process, the scientific process, is engaging the stakeholders who will be affected by the work that we do. And it is really powerful, and this commission especially has been great at inviting the lived experience to the table to talk about what these issues might be. And I think especially when we're talking about the implications of science, this is where having people around the table who will be affected by the science is really important. When we were doing our neuroscience project, we had folks from all kinds of organizations, mental health organizations, the Alzheimer's groups, and others come and talk to us about what is the lived experience and what are the implications for this kind of research, and it was extremely fruitful to hear those perspectives. So I just want to wrap up by saying, our path to ethical excellence in science, it's a complex path. It's going to take a lot more than the very siloed ways we do ethics now. It's going to take a commitment from all of us to infuse ethics into the way we do business in science. And from the very beginning of conceptualizing a project to the very end of seeing the fruits of our labor, the implementation of our work. It's going to take for us to think at every step in the scientific process, not only about what we can do, but about what we should do. And when we put the can and the should together, we will use science and do science in a way that will be reflective of our best It will help us help human flourishing. It will help us set an example not only for our peers, but for our scientific peers long into the future. And I welcome you and your comments now to talk a little bit about what kinds of things you're thinking about in terms of the ethical excellence of your science. So I'd like to welcome you to the microphones and open this up for discussion. Thank you very much. Questions or comments, thoughts, reactions? For those of you who are students in the room, I'm especially interested in your perspectives on this. Hi.
Hey, my name is Austin Order. I was just thinking about going back to the paper being published and the amount that's had to be, I guess, lost their credibility for ethical reasons. As far as implementing ethics and the drive that, I guess, universities and research have for money and establishing something new, do you think it's almost going to take a requirement of consulting people, I guess, a board of people looking at the ethics behind it before publishing or something like that to actually make it to where it's interatable and not still seeing the same trend?
Yeah, that's a great question and an interesting idea. So for the recording, the question was really, should we implement some kind of ethical review of papers and things to ensure that things were done well, so we can prevent this kind of retraction and you know, the ramifications that happen to a university and a researcher when they do something in error. I think it's really interesting. A lot of what we wanted to do and what we succeed at doing with an IRB, with an institutional review board, is the review of the ethical treatment of the participants before the study starts. And, you know, get some advice about how to do it, do things in an ethical way. So that pre-review happens for the research ethics piece of it. The question about what we should do in terms of reviewing about the implications, for example, of research, whether they're ethical or what could possibly happen there, whether there are some unforeseen consequences that might make things worse, et cetera. One of the things that I think is really a key piece in ensuring that those perspectives are infused throughout the process is that it's more than the responsibility of an ethicist to come, look, and give you the okay. It's really each scientist's ethical responsibility to meet those expectations. And the question really is, how do we instill that? I mean, to have ethical scientists, we need ethical people to become scientists, right? So, and there are many, many examples of, you know, amazingly productive and really important science being done that's being done ethical every single day. It is a rarity that science is done unethically. It's just that it gets the most noise. So it seems bigger to us. But for the most part, scientists want to do the right thing and do the right thing. The thing that is important here, and the message I hope to get across this afternoon, is that there is often a time when a scientist might say, something about this doesn't feel right. And frankly, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what the words are. I don't want to crash this whole project. My whole team is relying on me to get this through. I think the solution is just to pretend that I don't feel it or to try. But what we want is for that to be able to be part of the conversation. Yeah, that's going to happen. Let's talk about that and let's reflect on that. And let's ensure that transparent process happens so when the paper gets out, it's been through all that. So I'm not sure that, you know, that another regulatory board reviewing something is going to do anything. I think what we're talking about really is infusing that kind of ethical responsibility across the lifespan of the research and the science. Thanks. Sure. Hi.
Hello, I'm Sam. Earlier you had mentioned that it was hard or at least different to introduce like
That's an excellent question. The question was, so we talked, I mentioned earlier about how it can be a challenge to start in graduate school to teach people about ethical reasoning and such, or expectations of ethical science. And so the question was, what can we offer people who might feel similarly that ethics is going to stop their work or they're afraid to bring it up? How can we encourage the use of the resources that are available to researchers? I think that's an interesting question. Again, there's so many influences on our behavior and on an ethical scientist's behavior. Some of those are related to our psychology, our psychological profile, so to speak. Some are related to the atmosphere in which we do our work. We know that atmospheres where ethical and transparent science is done create ethical and transparent science. So we know that atmospheres matter. Individuals and systems have to be together. And one of the things we have to make sure of is that it's okay for a scientist to say, this doesn't feel right. I need to figure out what this is. I need to articulate what this is. I need to review some potential solutions and then watch what happens and act accordingly. That has to be okay and actually part of the scientific process. So I think we start by saying, here you are conceptualizing an experiment. What might this mean? It's like the student who was talking about this mushroom species. Like, what might it mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything in my lab right here while I'm staring at this fungus. But if you roll it out a few steps, you can see that there are implications. And and not to say that we shouldn't do it because there are implications, but to say, how do we ensure that we're ready for those, that we deal with those, and that we talk about those, that we engage the stakeholders who will be affected by these things, and ensure that their voice is heard, and we recognize what the concerns are. So I think part of it is a change in culture. A part of it is ensuring that those students who are going into graduate programs have an expectation that they will be doing ethical science, and helping those of us who are here now doing science who haven't had ethical training get that and prepare us to nurture that in our upcoming generations. Great question. Other questions or comments? Well, oh, yes, please, come on up.
I'll just try from here.
Okay.
So I really enjoyed what you had to say. Among the things, talking about recognizing and then being able to articulate, sort of unpack and articulate what sort of moral dynamic, or there is a moral dynamics that there are. And also the idea of engaging people with ethical thought and discussion early on. I'm just wondering if in discussing this, let's say, as a committee and so forth, if you all have dealt with some pushback or better, but concerns that people have about having too much on the table in class. Ethics being one more sort of thing you have to somehow wedge into the curriculum. And if so, what sort of thoughts, what sort of proposals people have for in a manageable sort of way bringing it into the curriculum?
Excellent question, and this is one we hear often from teachers, which is, yes, ethics matters, it's important, I want my students to be able to recognize and articulate what's going on. I just don't have room in my curriculum for that. How will we wedge, as you say, that into what we're doing? So there's been a long discussion and conversation about what is the best way to do ethics education. Is it that we do it like we do reading or math, which is you learn a certain set of skills, not for the sake of doing them. I didn't learn how to do arithmetic because I love to figure out how much 12 plus 15 is. But I learned how to do arithmetic so I could apply it in my life and do other things well. So, but in order to do that, I have to have the basics. So the question is, do we have to teach people kind of the basics around ethics so then they can go be integrated into everything you're doing. Or, so there are people who think that that's a critical piece. And there are also, I don't think it's an either or, but there's also this other piece that say, we don't have time to do something special. We can't have a separate class. People don't take it seriously. It's too much. It takes time out of the other things we have to prepare kids to do by the time they graduate. So let's just infuse it across the curriculum. Let's let everybody talk about ethics always in every situation, or where it's appropriate. And I do think that there is some benefit to both of those. I think knowing how to look at an ethical problem once one has recognized one, and to think about the process it takes to reflect on that and think about a way forward is a skill set we can teach people. I know because I learned it. And I know that others who do graduate work in bioethics learn it too. It's critical for us to think about ethics both as a fundamental skill and as something we use. And my analogy is that the mathematics. The question we get, especially from middle and high school teachers, is, we have so many requirements. It was a real focus on testing. Now it's, just in some cases, competency-based learning, but we don't have time to teach this. And what I say back to that is what we've heard from so many people who've taught ethics, which is ethics is, if we infuse it in the subjects we already teach, we are doing an enormous service to teach our kids about recognizing, articulating, and resolving ethical problems in teaching we already do. And a great example of that was this instructor from the community college who came, he's a biology teacher, and he's really interested in helping kids that he teaches, young adults, how to recognize what the implications of science are. And he does that through incorporating ethics conversations into his classroom and letting people talk about the ethical observations they're making about science. It doesn't take away at all from what he covers in his course. It really enriches. It engages students. The other thing that's really important about that is we do have some certain sets of expectations that kids must meet when they're graduating high school. Common Core is one, the next generation science. I mean, there are all these ways in which we can measure skills. One thing we know is that ethics and teaching about ethics and ethical reasoning teaches many of those things that they're expected to know. It teaches critical thinking. That's on the Common Core. It teaches critical and synergistic and synthesis writing, for example, synthesizing things in writing. That's something kids need to know how to do. So ethics can be a tool to get us to some of those requirements. At the same time, can help teach these skills. So I don't think it is a zero-sum game. I do think that there are lots of examples of really bright teachers who are incorporating this stuff every day. And those incorporating ethics education really can help their kids organize their thoughts and reach some of the goals of the Common Core, for example. Lots of examples of that happening all around. Okay, yeah.
If I could follow up.
Sure.
I was especially interested in what you just said about critical thinking. It seems that ethical reasoning, insofar as it involves reflecting, articulating the science, it seems very much like a form of critical thinking, which, as you say, is something, is a sort of capacity and skill that people need to have. Do you have any particular, are there any examples you could talk about? It sounds like a really interesting idea to as one of the ways of developing a program in critical thinking or a skill of critical thinking, to use ethical critical thinking.
So the question is, are there examples of using teaching ethics and ethical kind of thinking to actually teach critical thinking? And of course, there are lots of examples of people using that. And one of the things that I think is really important in the way in which this can happen is, we ask students when they're faced with an ethical case or in some ethical dilemma especially, to consider the evidence. So the first thing they have to do is, what evidence do we have to support any of our approaches here, or our decisions, our options. And that evidence sometimes is scientific evidence, so that can help students learn how to read and consume scientific literature, including, sorting through what's hype and what's real, considering what the source of information is, which is an especially important part of critical thinking. So there's the scientific evidence, then there's kind of the real life evidence. That is, how does this problem affect people, or how will our decision actually impact people, and should we talk with them and figure out what that is? So it brings in not just the scientific information, but the lived experience kind of information. And then to actually consider the ethical dimensions of it, which is part of what ethical reasoning is. And then to think about consequences. If we choose A, then these are the results. If we choose B, these are the results. If we choose C, that's that. Again, a really important way to think, to teach kids how to think critically, to evaluate options. So there are, I think about the case studies we have on our website, for example, and how they, after reviewing the Common Core and the expectations and looking at what we have there, I think, wow, so many of these would be great tools for teachers to get there. And the good part about it is it engages students. It's not only about factual information, but when you, any of you who have teenagers know this, when you, or have ever been a teenager, know this, that when you start to ask teenagers about why and what matters and what should be done and why it should be done, that engages them. Where facts might or might not, but when you can meet them where they are, where they're concerned about whether they're social issues or scientific issues, meet them where they are, and most times that place is around what's the right thing to do, and it's around the ethics, and to be able to use that as a springboard to then teach the science and to teach the critical thinking is really, in my opinion, it seems like a really efficient way to do that. So lots of people are doing that, and I think it's really an important thing to recognize. One of the things that the Commission will talk about in their upcoming report is how that can be how the Common Core expectations can be learned through ethical reasoning and teaching ethical reasoning, which I think will be really important. Okay. I just want to be aware of time. We're past the hour, and I'm really appreciative and grateful for your engagement in this topic. I am, as I said, delighted to be here to talk about this, especially in the context of the year-long reflection on rigor and excellence in science. And I am especially pleased to have been invited by Dan, who is a fellow Wisconsinite, so we go way back, even though we've only known each other for a couple of years, and to all of you for coming here and being concerned about these issues and thinking carefully and reflectively about ethics and excellence in science. So thank you very much, and I will be around for a little bit afterward if anyone wants to chat. Thank you.